So it's very nice to be here. It's been a long time since I've actually been at the U of R campus. I lived in Rochester for a year in between transitioning from industry to starting a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin. And so it's nice to be back in town. I have very fond memories of especially the food in the city. So I came all the way from Buffalo, where I would like to introduce y'all to a couple of projects that I started kind of toward the end of my postdoc, collaborating with a couple of colleagues at the University of Illinois. And I've been really puzzled by this general question of language processing and how specific are the types of things that we access during language processing. So that's kind of twofold. Both we have comprehension mechanisms and production mechanisms. But more concretely, a lot of folks talk about prediction and production at this kind of lexical level process, right? So that we retrieve individual words to talk to other people. Word is a very kind of laden term. And so I was sort of wondering, well, can we actually think about this in a more general way? And this led to, an informal hypothesis that hierarchical structure, such as semantics, that we might involve at lexical classes or even, syntactic structures, should really matter for comprehension. But then this got more formalized for me when I read this Quistot, Beckering, and Van Rooy paper that outlined a Bayesian account of hierarchical processing. And specifically, it states that in certain cases of uncertainty, you should, in fact, predict at a more general level than a more specific one. Now, this is really interesting, I think, and more broadly, just within the Bayesian cognitive science framework, we can think of statistical knowledge and optimizing our knowledge of language as living at multiple different levels of representation. And so one of the things that we can kind of think about when we look at the sort of overall linguistic structures, that not only words, but sounds and the syntactic categories that words belong to, sentences that we process, all belong to these broader levels, classes of events. And so I want us to start to think a little bit about how language processing might reflect not just specifics of individual lexical items, but also things about the classes to which that element belongs to and how that's constrained by context. Now, this might seem sort of obvious, but it turns out that it's really tricky to try and identify this hierarchical structure. Obviously, linguists have spent quite some time trying to carve up the world into linguistic categories, things like nouns and verbs or other types of morphemes, syntactic phrases, things like that. But we struggle and have struggled for the last 60 years or so to identify what high-level semantic or quasi-semantic categories might exist out there in language processing. And so this project is partly in that direction. We're trying to really understand that. So here's a high-level thing I'd like you to try. How many of you have heard, or actually, how many of you would be inclined to end the sentence, friends are always able to finish each other's sandwiches? And this is probably just if you're like the kind of person who reads dumb jokes online and you think this is really great. Obviously, friends are also usually able to finish each other's sentences. And so if we're able to do this, we use the language production system to make predictions about what other people are going to say. And this type of task is known as a closed task, where if we're guessing the last word in a sentence or we're guessing the next word that our friend is about to say, we're trying to fill in the blank. Now, this is a sort of non-typical production task. It's not certainly what I'm doing right now, but it does reveal some of the inner workings of the language processing system. It is incidentally also so metaphorically close to the way that we train statistical language models, which are not the topic of this talk, but if you want to talk to me about those things, we can do that too. Okay, so we have statistical knowledge, we have some particular tasks. How do we actually look at how hierarchical processing works? Well, the first part of the talk, I'm going to introduce you to attempts to quantify the hierarchical structure that's evident in language production data using the closed task. I'll introduce a data set that we collected from basically a large-scale serial norm data set from a very kind of classic stimulus set. You'll really enjoy these items. And then we validate the hierarchical structures that we infer. And then we're testing the effect of those hierarchical structures on on word production. And we'll later show that the same procedure also helps to explain sentence reading. So some of you may be familiar with the kind of classic Leyfelt model of language production. This is generally thought of as the process of turning a message or a conceptual representation into a physical signal. This could be an articulatory sequence. This could be either signed, or it could be a speech signal. It could be typing. All of these have a different sort of sequence component to them. But something that we still don't really understand is how we're going to conceptualize the concepts that we're trying to convey. And this hierarchical process isn't really specified in this nice little diagram, right? We don't really know what the lexical representation is. And so I've been really inspired by some work that I did as part of my postdoc with Mary Ellen McDonald, where we were trying to specify at a better level what these messages actually look like. And what are the factors that go into the message? Well, first of all, we might think that we have to convey an idea. So maybe that's, say, this object here, this little picture. You might say this is a chimp or a chimpanzee, depending on how pretentious you're feeling. But how pretentious you're feeling is something that's actually a bit more about the context, rather than the concept that you're trying to convey. All of these factors combine, we say maybe have a mutual constraint satisfaction that we're trying to do here to pick the best one in context. But we ultimately have to represent that message as some kind of set of features or some elements that we want to make sure get across. From that message, we can then assume that we access a lexical item, and that lexical item is going to be distributed across other possibilities, right? It's not the case that if I have to say something, I'm always going to say it exactly the same way. I'm going to vary it up a little bit. Minimally, the articulatory process will never be the same twice. So we want to have a system that's actually flexible enough to allow for that kind of variability. We know that hierarchical structure influences word choice. Even if you look at things like speech error data, the semantic neighbors that are associated with a particular word are more likely to produce errors that people will say. So if I say cat, it might be because I really intended to say dog. This suggests that there is, in fact, some way that these words are connected to each other. But normally the way that this is instantiated in models of production is as fully connected features associated with all of the lexical items that you know, which seems really hard. If I wanted to kind of narrow down a message to a specific single symbol, I have to somehow consider every word that I know. That seems really slow. So we actually need some mechanism that allows us to narrow down our responses, and maybe instead of assuming that we're thinking about all words at once, we consider a smaller set of words that are more constrained by, say, the taxonomic structure of the words that we know. That is to say, there's some hierarchical category information that we borrow. So the first set of studies is going to continue to question about how hierarchical structure influences production. And so I'm going to introduce you to some stimuli that are going to form the basis of a serial closed task. This is a procedure where we ask participants to guess the next word for every single word in a sentence. It's a little bit weird. It's not that different from being really annoying to a friend and trying to guess what the next thing they're going to say is, but it's not a very natural task. We're really trying to get a sense of all the things that could possibly go in that position. The task that we did, we do have production times, but it's not a speeded closed task. It does turn out that our distribution of response times is very similar to speeded closed tasks, because if you pay crowdsourced participants, they want to get out as fast as possible. But if you want to nitpick this, we can talk about that later. The stimuli come from Federmeyer et al., 2007. These are a really interesting set of stimuli that vary in their constraint. So some sentences very strongly predict one particular kind of word, and other sentences don't really strongly predict a particular kind of word. So, like, for example, we have the sentence here, his skin was red from. I want you to take a guess at what this might be. This is a pretty unconstraining sentence. There's lots of things that it could be red from, right? Okay, so, yeah, no. What's your guess?
Eczema.
Eczema. That is one of the answers, actually. We have from birth, from bites, from crying, from eczema, scratching, sitting, staying, from the sun, sunburn, from death. There's actually a lot of structure in this. So something that I want to kind of show you as we walk through this alluvial chart is that there are things that articles, there are certain parts of speech that people will guess. They also tend to guess nouns and they can guess verbs. But these words also have other hierarchical structures. So within verbs, for example, we have words that kind of are more about sort of activities, and some of them are more about like the feeling of, like things that itch you. So there's a lot of hierarchical structure. The parts of speech are only one level of abstraction that we are actually interested in. So we know that syntax matters, right? Nobody's ever guessing that syntax is important for production, but then the question becomes, is some sort of semantic structure also really useful? So what we do here, and I'm going to show you about the method too, is we measure this structure using a clustering mechanism that I'm going to refer to as Gaussian mixture models or Bayesian Gaussian mixture models. We're going to try and learn what these sort of subcategories are for all of the responses for all of these stimuli at every single word in all of these sentences. Okay? And we're going to estimate this space in a really nice sort of mathematical framework that produces probabilities sort of for free. So we can think about words as belonging to distributions of responses. Here's the sort of simplified version of that. We have along this x-axis particular values, and along this y-axis there's a density of those values. I just said, okay, let's take two normal distributions and squish them together, and we're just going to plot what those values look like. Now, if I wanted to learn what those normal distributions were, I would probably draw a line saying, okay, well, here's like a little curve on this guy, and then here's another curve on this guy. The Gaussian mixture model is trying to figure out what those densities are. So what are the values that generated this data? This becomes a little bit easier to understand when we look in a two-dimensional space. So if you look at these two clusters, we see this kind of oval shape, and we see this more circular shape. What if we have a way to infer what those clusters are and where those boundaries are? Gaussian mixture models provide a framework for this that importantly assign a probability to each of these data points. So any one of these circles in either of these dots, any one of the dots in either of these circles has some probability of being assigned to one cluster or another. The cool thing about it is the model actually just optimizes for the probabilities of these assignments, and that gives us nice little tight distributions in this particular case that more or less correspond to the oval shape and this big blobby circular shape. Okay, so Gaussian mixture models. So that's like a nice little toy example. How do we scale this up to actual human data? And I would be lying to you if I didn't say LLMs were not part of this slightly, because it's a little tricky to cluster all the answers that people give you. So here's an example cluster that we learned from the responses that participants give to these stimuli. So we have eczema, we have verbs, we have all these other kinds of cases of things that might make your skin red. Then we have all these other sentences and all these other completions. And it turns out that people often say things like body parts. These are a natural class that automatically shows up in basically every data set that I've found. Body parts very nicely clustered together. So here's one that has knee, face, nose, tail, eyes, skin, and so on, right? Nice little nouns. We obtain this cluster by taking each of these responses in the sentences that they occur. We compute an embedding. That's just a way to approximate all the semantic stuff that we care about. And then we say, okay, Bayesian Gaussian mixture model, instead of these two beautiful dimensions from the previous slide, what if you had 768 possible dimensions? Can you cluster these for us? And it turns out that the responses that we get are usually pretty coherent. So the neat thing about Bayesian Gaussian mixture models is that they allow us to have clusters of different sizes, of different densities. We can have lots of different words that vary across. Words can be assigned to multiple clusters, and you can have the same word form that gets assigned to different clusters depending on the context. So, for example, if we have a word like paper, and paper refers to the material, so like paper that you would throw for confetti, versus paper, like a journal article, those would be different representations. So we can learn that, scientific products are very different from different types of physical types of materials. Now, I want to stop here actually, because I think that maybe you might have questions about the clusters first, or about how this is actually optimized. So if anybody has any questions, I would be very happy to answer. Okay. Yes. Yes, of course.
I have a question. So how is it different from like k-means, those other?
Well, so you can use k-means to initialize this, to sort of start hypotheses about the locations of these sort of centroids. You can also do all of this with k-means. The thing that I like about Bayesian Gaussian mixture models is that they have a probabilistic interpretation that really nicely dovetails with these kinds of Bayesian cognitive models. But k-means, certainly you could use, say, distance for a data point from one cluster to another. The really nice thing about this framework is that you get means and variances along multiple axes. And so this is a little bit more of deciding what the boundaries are of the space in terms of like a multivariate Gaussian distribution. But yeah, that's a great question. I have informally clustered some of these things and validated that the clusters are more or less the same across methods. There is a pretty high degree of agreement, but I like Bayesian Gaussian mixture models for this other cognitive reason. I think Joyce was first, and I'll get to you.
I think you may have just answered this, but all of those items are nouns. Can you include things like being out in the sun as a reply?
I'm so sorry.
Lots of math today. All of the items are nouns.
In this particular cluster.
Can you include things like being out in the sun into this model without disturbing the...
Oh, interesting. So using phrases or something similar? Well, yeah, so in theory, I can tell you that one of the things that we've had to do with the data in order to get the clusters to kind of be this clear is take the first word that participants actually produce, because sometimes participants produce multiple words. Sometimes they do add things like being out in the sun. And so then in those cases, we actually went through and looked at the response and wrote being instead, because it turns out that phrases clustered with phrases, typos clustered with typos, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't have that sort of influencing the structure of this too much. That's the sort of artifact of the language model representation. So to kind of zoom back out, one of the things that I've really wanted to do is a more like low-level version of the evaluation, where we actually ask participants to rate the similarity between the items. This would kind of evade some of the sort of lexical level overlap thing and actually say like, okay, well, being out in the sun and a sunburn are actually really similar, right? Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question. Yeah, so phrases actually do sometimes show up, and sometimes they do cluster with each other. They don't tend to show up in the same clusters as the other words for a given preamble. But yeah, that is an inconvenience and also really interesting.
I think my question is actually related to both of those. So
Ooh.
The response about k-means is GMMs kind of are more flexible because they allow you to have different shapes, and like they can be kind of rotated.
Yeah. K-means has like a very spherical kind of constraint because of the.
And so I'm wondering, is there evidence that that GMMs are kind of flexible enough, in the sense that is there really evidence that the distributional structure of these categories within the spaces that one of these models learn actually well by Gaussians? Because I can imagine them having very complex shapes that lie on like smooth.
Yeah. So I do not know if they actually are at the global level multivariate Gaussians. I can tell you that most of the dimensions are normally distributed. So you would hope that if every single dimension of these vectors is normally distributed, then you would ultimately have something that looks nice in n-dimensional space. But I guess it doesn't follow, like they could still be kind of funky, like banana shapes or something similar to that. Yeah. We've tried other versions of this where we reduce the dimensionality also in a way that should force this, and we got worse results. So if you run PCA over these vectors or otherwise normalize, it seems to throw away some really important information in the neighborhood structure of the words. But yeah, I would love to know, even if there was like a nice little proof that I could show that it would do this in, you know, sort of a toy case, that would be really fantastic. Yeah, if anyone wants to work with me over the summer and do that with me, that would be great. My students are not as mathy as you might imagine. So, okay, this is fun. These are really cool. This is a really great instance of a category that's nice little nouns, body parts, but I also can show you that we did this with a bunch of different data sets, and we find a lot of variability. And some of them are more straightforward than others. So for example, if we look at the Federmeyer et al. Stimuli, these are clusters that across her stimulus items all kind of have the same energy as disasters. Also, apparently, harvest is involved in this. Maybe there's something like, maybe Lakoff has some opinion about whether harvest is like a disaster or not. But these words all kind of show up in a cluster: fire, drought, storm, hurricane, and so on. We also have sentences from, for example, Luke and Christensen, which use naturalistic stimuli, so they're not laboratory sentences. As far as I can tell, Stephen Luke just like dug up a bunch of websites and thought that some of the pages were interesting and put those in his stimulus set. And this one case, this is more of a physics document. They have words that are largely plurals or end in S's. So we have solids, shells, receptors, impulses, signals, gases, as well as other chemicals or sort of like ions, right? We have neutron, we have shell, we have carbon. So these elements all show up in the same cluster here. And then we have another cluster learned by in the Lauder et al. Stimuli. These are all serial closed tasks where you guess the next word. These ones include sort of standard reading assessments texts. So these are designed to kind of show that you read at like an 8th grade reading level or a 12th grade reading level and so on. And we get basic level categories for most of these things. So dog, horse, chicken, cat. Then you have some more specific ones: penguin, pigeon, tiger. This is actually a very large category that includes a lot of monomorphemic English words, animal categories. Yeah, I think I have a question. Are we good? It's okay if you do have questions. I don't mind. I've also shown that it doesn't have to be serial closed. You can get these types of clusters with other types of data sets. So if you just have sentence final versions of this, you can also get the same pattern. I wanted to show also that the clusters that are learned are very syntactically coherent. I'm going to show the degree to which each of the clusters varies in its syntactic, so part of speech level, English part of speech level entropy. So we're just going to assume that each word can have some distribution over parts of speech, or each cluster has some different distribution over parts of speech. If we were going to do this in a random way, entropy would be quite high, 0.75. But it turns out that almost all of the clusters have zero variation in the dominant part of speech that they're assigned. So you might also be like, well, this is picking up on syntax. And yes, that's definitely true. One of the points I think is that syntax is a nice other hierarchical level processing. Part of speech information is often thrown away when we start to think about lexical level predictability. And now you're probably like, okay, but are these clusters actually useful, right? Because like maybe it's kind of weird that harvest is in this cluster with fire and drought and storm and so on. So then we ran a study where we got ratings of participants' sense of coherence for these different clusters. So we either took the actual clusters that the model learned, or we scrambled words from those clusters to make a roughly equal size match. And then we had participants rate on a Likert scale whether they thought the cluster was coherent or not, as well as whether they thought that the cluster was taxonomically similar. So the elements all sort of belong to a similar semantic category. very broadly defined for non-experts, or thematically similar, where we thought about it as sort of event level similarity. And what we also find, so first of all, is that the clusters are very coherent when they're coherent, and they're not very coherent when we scrambled them. Although there are some clusters that are not very good, for reasons that are not totally obvious to me. There's probably all kinds of reasons that I would love to dig into. Okay, the clusters are sort of coherent. We can also look at what people think relates the coherence to the similarity type. So is it more taxonomic, or are they more thematic in nature? We see that participants generally rate taxonomic similarity lower. So FOIL, these scrambled ones have lower degrees of taxonomic similarity. And the actual ones have higher degrees of taxonomic similarity. So the difference between these black and orange ones basically shows that there's greater degrees of taxonomic sort of coherence in these clusters, but that it's also important that the coherent ones have more of that than the foils. There are apparently some of these clusters are also somewhat coherent in the foil case. I don't know what this means, and I don't know what they look like, but the error bars suggest that it's not that many of them that are very highly coherent. That's something to consider. Okay, so taxonomic structure, that's great. We see that there's some degree to which they think that these words all kind of belong to similar categories, but maybe there's some other stuff going on. If we think about this in terms of event structure, it seems like there's not really a lot of event structure kind of information that's encoded in this. So the overall pattern even looks like, well, the foil clusters have a greater degree of thematic similarity than the coherent clusters that we generate, suggesting that indeed they do understand thematic similarities involving some degree of part of speech and semantic variability, right? That the words are not necessarily closely related. This is basically like a reality check to make sure that we're able to use these clusters for predicting psycholinguistic variables. Yes.
Kind of
No, I love that.
here a little bit. It's all based on probabilities at the output layer of some language model or something like that.
They're not actually probabilities yet. These are actually the embedding representations from the inner layers of the Roberta model. So I use Roberta for a few different reasons. One of which I attempted to write, and then they told me I hadn't written enough computational linguistics papers to be able to submit to this workshop, which is very insulting. I've been reviewing for these venues for the last 9 years, and they were like, "You can't review anymore." Okay, great. So one of the things that we have worked with is I have checked whether these embeddings that we've been using are really good or not. Something that you might want to know is that the next word prediction models like GPT-2 actually produce worse representations for this type of task than the, like, say, encoder type ones, which might even kind of make sense to you from like a production metaphor kind of perspective, that an encoder is trying to encode a message, whereas a decoder is trying to guess what the next thing is. The higher level layers are very strongly sensitive to the prediction tasks that these models are trained to, and so those are actually also less good. I don't actually use any of the values for the predictions that the models make. It turns out that's partly because most of these models make really bad predictions in context. So for example, if I ask you to complete the sentence, "The day was breezy, so the boy went outside to fly a kite," the models that I've been using mostly guess drone, which is really disturbing. I mean, like, maybe, but not on a breezy day. And certainly not, that's probably not the sense of drone that they mean, right? They're probably thinking of much bigger drones than children would fly. So these clusters are indeed learned from a language model. I have a hedging bullet point at the end of the talk where, and we can talk about this now. I have wanted to get labels for the clusters that are derived in part from like a formal ontology. So I've thought about and struggled with just subsetting to the nouns and looking at, say, WordNet hierarchies. So for example, different types of domestic cats should kind of cluster together, or different household pets should cluster together, right? And I've wanted to see like, well, is it the case that maybe the path similarity between all of the words that are in each of these clusters is reasonably low? I have not done that analysis, partly because this method works really well on its own. But I think there's also lots of evidence from the human behavioral data that the clusters are doing an okay job. But I would like to know if there's something that the model's picking up on that's a bit deeper than that. I don't know that the language models actually capture all the important dimensions of the knowledge that we use. I wish that they did. And I think it would be a little creepy if they did, because some of the categories that are in this are linguistically specific. So they have very specific linguistic meanings, but then others have very embodied ones. So, abstract sort of feelings, for example, are not going to be as well represented. It turns out also that I think one of the things that affects the clusters in general, that I don't know if this is the case for human beings, is that word frequency really strongly influences whether things are in the same cluster. So more specific words or longer words tend to be clustered together. And I think that maybe you could reason that like more specific words should be more similar to each other because they're at a lower level of specificity. But it also means that you're apparently throwing away some of the higher order structure that's also useful for this. And so I would love to do the best version of this. I've thought also about, are we a Binder paper? Are we a Binder features kind of venue? I would love to spend more time with those. So to get sort of neurally inspired features for some of these words. But I don't know how you do that for a preposition. I don't know how you do that for a determiner. And scaling this up to all the parts of speech has also been really tricky. Yeah, they're really designed for specific types of content words. And they're probably sort of specific to English. I know that there have been attempts to extend this to multiple languages, but the technique itself is a little bit restrictive.
Yeah, I don't want to delay.
No.
Process necessarily, but the plot on the right, I was trying to relate it back a little bit to the you gave us earlier where you were talking about the skin was red because of it. So I don't really still have a great sense what these clusters then look like when they come out of this.
Yeah, well, so.
And some, probabilistically they might have similar scores. They're not the same, their representations aren't the same in the middle of somewhere.
No, it's certainly the case, yeah.
They cluster together, so that wouldn't explain why the coherence score would be lower, even though they're likely words.
Right. So part of it is that these clusters are aggregated across examples, so they're not specific to a single sentence. And part of it is also there's additional sort of embodied information that's not, so there might be like explanations for why some things are together for a given cluster that maybe are less clear in the aggregate. But so let's take the same example. If we sort of actually, did I ignore this version? This might be, it's too small. Okay, ignore the left side. Each of the categories that the model learns, these arbitrary numbers in the middle, are clusters that correspond to words that belong to those categories. So like, for example, cluster 21 is entirely the D cluster, but there's also cluster 7 that links to bytes and to sun, which have a similar, I think, consequence, right? There's not things that like have a lot of agency, but it's like, this is the thing that's made it red. There's also verbs that cluster in slightly different ways. So like eczema is all on its own, birth is all on its own. But then all of the verbs are actually pretty distinct from each other here. I have another version of this that's also very nice for the provo corpus when we talk about language comprehension. That one's a case where we're looking at different types of, this one's a case where like there's a bunch of physicists and they're discovering stuff. And so like what kinds of things are, what kinds of verbs are people guessing, basically. But yeah, I think that it is a little hard to know exactly how these manifest for any one preamble. So let me actually show you, after we get this kind of cluster validation stage, what we do to estimate the probabilities of a category is actually at the level of a single sort of stem. So if we were actually, the day was breathy, then you would have the probabilities of so and because and maybe other types of words. We have a closed probability. This is a garden variety number. That's just the proportion of times that a person said a given word for a given context. And we divide that by all the responses for that context. But the cluster probability is derived from the closed probabilities. So we have basically a sum of all the times that we've seen each word, probabilities assigned to those, and then we aggregate by cluster. So categories that are probable are going to be ones that have words that are very probable in that category. It's also sort of important to think about this in the, I phrase this. The clusters themselves, because they're derived from closed probabilities, do produce some difficulties in estimating the effects. They are somewhat they're collinear, so trivially so. But there are the model comparisons that I'll show you show that there's a clear benefit to also having hierarchical information in the model. So let's see, how am I'm doing okay on time. I talk too fast, so tell me, I'm going to slow down a little bit. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to show was not just are the clusters reasonable, but also is it the case that the clusters have predictive power beyond just the closed probabilities that we see? So the lexical definitions of predictability that rely on individual word level probabilities throw away this hierarchical structure that we're interested in. So for that, we actually took the reaction times that are from the data that generated these responses. And like I told you, these are not speeded, so people do have a little bit of time to, start thinking about what they're doing. They can go back, they can type things. So if they made typos, we don't have a record of that. I would love to do that the right way next time, but it's still really interesting. So one of my longer term goals is actually to look at this in the as spoken responses rather than written responses, because people have different feelings about naming latencies versus other measures of production time. But we're going to build a linear mixed model of these reaction times. So the total time to submitting a response. And we're going to look at words that have neighbors versus not. So these are going to be words like, for example, bites and sun are assumed to be neighbors in this context because they are both responses assigned to category number 7. Or similarly, when somebody says the word birth, it's the only word in that category. And so the cluster probability there is, just the closed probability, basically. So we have this sort of definition of neighbors, so words that are not the only ones in their category. And the neighbors themselves, like that whole neighborhood, has a probability associated with it. And we have lots of reasons, I think, in the production literature to think that the neighborhood structure of people's responses should matter. So when we have words that are, it sort of depends on who you are and what kind of beliefs you have about production and what kind of experiments you run. But generally speaking, you can either get some facilitation from having neighbors, or you can have some sort of inhibition. Some people have even sort of specified that the specific density of those neighborhoods and whether the word is sort of a good example of that neighborhood, so how far away all of its neighbors are, influences production speed. I think the general consensus is that similar neighbors, very, very similar neighbors, are somewhat difficult to produce. They compete with each other, but then words that are sort of in a nice little neighborhood where everybody's sort of around, sort of facilitate each other. But there is, when you go to conferences, Dan Merman and like Gary Oppenheim will argue about what neighborhood structure is, and that's always a fun argument. I don't know that my results completely disambiguate between these theories, but I think they provide an interesting perspective on what neighborhood structure looks like. So you're probably like, okay, well, like independent of cluster probability, does closed probability matter? And it does. The more probable a response is, the faster people are to submit that response. This kind of could also go in the other way, right? That if you are going to submit a response fast, maybe you want to submit a word that's very easy. But it also turns out that when a word, this is really hard to see, when a word is not the only one in its cluster, so if there's a word like bites and sun, those two words actually do seem to make it harder to produce the word. This effect is actually really, it's not a linear effect. So there's a very, very interesting tail that seems to happen right around 100% closed probability, for reasons that I don't fully understand, but which I think could be modeled using a more of a process model. Adrian Staub is probably somewhere yelling at me. But the specific pattern seems a little bit complicated. Nevertheless, competitors seem to slow you down a little bit. So words that have neighbors are a little bit slower. Yes?
Isn't it by definition the case that the words with close probabilities that are very high don't have neighbors?
Yes, but so even at the same level, so if you have two words that are 0.9, one of them has the other 10% and it's the same category, but the other 10% are some other category. The one that has the same category is going to be slower than the one that has no related neighbors.
So these are all matched? That's what I'm asking.
So they're matched at the level of closed probability, but they're not matched in terms of the specific sentences.
It's whether they're matched except for the presence of competitors. So in other words, if you color the points by having a competitor.
Yeah. So I did have the colored version of this, and they do substantially overlap, but the absent case does have more purple dots underneath, and the present one has more yellow dots above. So they're somewhat separable, but they do overlap a lot. My point being that yes, there is some separability between the existence of the purple is not just trivially like only on one side of the plot, and yellow is not on the other side of the plot. It does seem to be continuous over this full range.
So my question is whether you have checked that this is not just due to the linearity assumption.
Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I suspect I have not, but I would like to know what to do.
If the true relation between close probability and seconds and time is nonlinear, for example, some people would argue that we should analyze log right?
Yeah.
Then having more points of one type more on the left and more points on the other type more would give you this pattern. The other thing is not going on.
Right. I don't know that this fully addresses your question, but I think it's a really important one. With this naturalistic data, it's a little tricky. So I have plotted these same data where I have looked at the specific value of the cluster probability so imagine that I have lines in addition to this that correspond to how probable the cluster is. Those are going to be all cases where basically the cluster probability is higher than the closed probability, except for cases where they're 100%. Those are what you see is a really wild, like nonlinear relationship for the ones where there are neighbors. And then when there are no neighbors, you get a nice little straight closed probability line. I would have to show you that plot, but it's in the manuscript. It's really confusing because it does suggest that the majority of this effect is driven by things in the middle. So maybe Dan Merman is really happy about those results. I have wanted to spend some more time thinking about the mechanisms. I think even just showing that this happened was something that was surprising to me. But I do think that that's a really good point. Yeah, the distributions are a little bit funky. Due to the definition of the probabilities, yeah.
I thought you'd asked this earlier, but it's about the notion of neighbor. So,
yeah.
I'm curious what it means to be in a cluster, since these are all going to be, so these are all computed from posteriors, presumably, and then are you taking the max across the posterior?
Yeah.
So does it change anything if you take like
probabilities?
Yeah, basically, if you say what's the probability that they have the same cluster on the base of the posteriors, I'm mainly wondering how peaky the posteriors are.
They are extreme.
Okay, so
this is an LLM problem.
Yeah.
So specifically, yeah. So the 768 dimensional space is so specific that it's actually really surprising that I could get clusters at all, given how far apart some of the data points are from each other. So in practice, the words are only assigned to one cluster from the training data.
Okay.
You can get probabilities if you futz with some of the parameters a little bit, you can get them to have more gradient probability assignment. But I haven't found that gives me better clusters. And then as a separate point, the you can also use the model to assign probabilities to unseen words. So one thing that we'll do with the reading time data is assign a cluster to words that were in the sentence, but not ones that participants necessarily guessed. And so you can get a cluster probability for those. And that probability is still predictive. But it is tricky. Like, I would love to get an actual probability of the words, but most of the time it's like, oh, this is the only category it belongs to if it was in the training data. Yes. I have not spent enough time regularizing the heck out of these. I would like to figure out the right way to do that. The implementation that I'm using is the scikit-learn one, and it's a little bit inflexible. But yeah, but that's really, yeah, the geometric properties of these embeddings are kind of a nightmare for getting anything more granular. But in principle, I would love to know about the gradient structure of these probabilities.
Well, the geometric properties drove my last question about is a Gaussian actually.
Yeah, right. So I think that they might be multivariate Gaussians, but that the actual distributions are just so tight that that it's very hard to assign any probability of a word to another cluster. Yeah. It is a little bit interesting. One of the things that you learn is some generalization. So the word the, for example, is pretty much always in its own cluster. A is usually in its own cluster, and maybe like the A and knowers in the room will also appreciate that Anne is usually in a different cluster. And I think that that's really interesting from a theoretical perspective, just because people often fight about whether people make predictions at the level of like the full form of the determiner, and it does seem like it matters. So it licenses different predictions and therefore should have different representations, my opinion.
Sorry, that brings
Yeah.
up something else.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No,
So,
if we don't get through this, I don't mind.
yeah.
No one needs to know what I
Another
did.
question about neighborhoods. So one thing you keep pointing out is that these clusters are kind of mixtures of like lots of different things. Like what you were mentioning just now on obviously it seems like they're points that might have been together apart, but that has to be based on phonetic information to some extent, right?
Yeah, right. They license, things that are likely to start with vowels or adjectives that start with vowels. Yeah.
So have you looked at trying to disentangle, say, phonetic neighborhood, semantic neighborhood here, where basically you would say, like, I was thinking compute how probable you are to be neighbors, but I guess it doesn't matter because these clusters are so peaky, but then trying to kind of residualize out how much of that is due to the phonetic form versus, and then try to treat the rest as kind of syntactic and
Yeah. Well, I don't have a picture of this here, I don't think. Or do I? This one might actually demonstrate this somewhat. So one of the things that you get is that sometimes morphological information is encoded, right? So plurals or past tenses, but you also tend to get lemmas associated with each other, which hopefully would make sense, right? So seeing, saw, shown, right? These are all sort of in the same semantic space. They have a similar fricativeness to them. I do not know how phonetically sort of narrow the distributions are. I can tell you that the way that we compute the embeddings is sensitive to word form information. So words that have the same lemmas are going to end up typically in the same categories. But it's not the case that a word is only in a single category. So like watched could show up in other cases, like if it was, for example, like a participle instead of the past tense form of the verb. But yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. This gets into a really fun subfield within language production, where folks talk about the sort of degree to which semantic facilitation and phonetic facilitation might be different from each other. I think that the growing consensus is that they work in similar ways, but then there's this interesting problem with like speech error data, for example, where people are more likely to slip to words that are both phonologically and semantically related than either of the two combined, sort of independently, which I think suggests that we would actually expect sort of the opposite effect, where a good cluster, maybe not necessarily these ones, should have sort of anti-similarity at the phonetic level. You would kind of hope that they would sort of repel each other in some important way. But I don't actually know if that's the case. That would be really cool to look at. There was a brief period of time during my postdoc with Mary Ellen that I tried to look at the neighborhood structure, like the sort of semantic similarity neighborhood structure. But this was like Kool-Aid, like I didn't fully work with these models yet. I was just doing word2vec, and I would love to dig back into that. One of the other things I've been curious about is looking at the extent to which these language models are sensitive to such patterns, because you would kind of hope that if they're picking up on some phonological structure, that they would also show, if it is in fact the case that these words repel each other in context, phonologically similar words tend to occur in different environments, then you should also show that with, like, say, the probabilities that the models give you. But I don't know if it's been shown in any other area than like the homophone literature, where I think it does seem like that might be the case. These are fun questions. Okay, so we're building a linear mixed specs model. Production times, I do believe, but I don't remember. If I log transformed these variables, the closed probabilities are log transformed. I don't remember if I log transformed the production times. They are skewed. They have the sort of predicted, some of the durations of production times are pretty tightly around like 700, 800 milliseconds, which is the whole production time, all the characters that they have to submit. But there are some folks who produce things like, some people just walked away from the computer when they answered these. And the results actually hold whether I exclude all of these cases or not. It seems like if I even just look at things that are under 1,000 milliseconds, all of the results I show here hold up with these analyses. But something that's not clear from this, okay, so like we know that if a word has a neighbor, it's probably going to be slower to be produced. But we can also see that clusters that are probable, independent of closed probability, are also faster to produce. So if I look at the relative probability of a word within its response, I think it's actually really interesting. There's this sort of nonlinearity in the shape that I have not tested with GAMs or anything fancy. But what you see is that high probability clusters tend to have faster reaction times independent of the closed probability. So closed probability is facilitative, so is cluster probability for these naming times. And it's something that kind of holds across all of the different categories. The shape of these functions is very similar. And one thing that I haven't fully figured out is why there seems to be something that really jumps down when you get to 100% closed probability. It seems like this part here is quite a bit lower. Like this slope of this gets very steep in comparison to the rest of the slopes. I've not figured out why that's the case. I suspect that like a Chen and Merman style model that involves settling on a word form would probably give me something like this. But then maybe I should go back to like a Staub type horse race model, and then maybe that would be something that would be easily predicted by the way that he thinks about things. I didn't want to get into that in this, but there's a whole bunch of folks who basically argue that there's no such thing as competition in production, and that it's all sort of just a product of the activation of a particular word. I think that this suggests that there's, in fact, at the very least, there's some marginalization that people are doing over semantic category structure for selecting the words that they want to pick. Okay, well, sorry about that. I didn't manage to slow down. Okay, so overall, it seems like productions are sensitive to the alternatives that are available. That having high probability clusters is beneficial overall. This is especially true for rarer and medium probability words. And also, it's still there's still some negative consequences to having neighbors overall, which is possibly like an artifact of the probabilities that we're using here. So this is just production. I love production, but what about comprehension? This seems like a really great case where you would expect people to maybe like not be sensitive to this because we're already, you know, just coping with all of the information that we get when we do language comprehension. The same framework that I highlighted earlier suggests that in fact hierarchical information should be really important for sentence processing too. And we know from a long literature that syntactic structure and syntactic prediction really strongly constrain reading times. But we also have somehow in the last like 10 years shifted to this purely lexical orientation that drives me fucking crazy. Like, obviously word processing matters, but once you get to the level of word, you're starting to think about, well, okay, people are predicting words. And how many words do we know? 50,000 something words? Like, how big of the scope is it? Is it phrases? Do we predict phrases? Do we predict the morphemes too? Like, where do you say you should draw the line? And so I was just sort of grumpy and I was reasoning that in fact we should probably predict something more general than just individual words. So like return. We then decided to extend this method to everybody's favorite data set, which is the oral corpus. I swear to God, I can't wait to be done with this particular data set and collect my own corpus because this is a nightmare to work with. Like has anybody ever worked with anybody else's data? This is terrible. Like they tokenize the text in a way that makes no sense to me. It's very difficult to reconstruct their algorithms. They didn't share their code for that. I also don't have any of the individual closed responses. I only have the aggregate data, and there are errors in their aggregates because some of their sentences all start the same way. And so they're computing closed probabilities independent of the sentences that they're getting. So in fact, there's more granularity in their data than they report in the original paper. So the Provo corpus is a nice corpus for other reasons, though. It's a fully parallel corpus of closed responses and reading times at like the 18 different kinds of reading times that you can have. Now, I'm not the kind of person who really enjoys analyzing every single measure, especially because I'm not an eye-tracking person and I don't want to p-hack my way into finding results. So what I'm going to present to you are going to be analyses of just two levels. First, fixation duration, which is the very first the amount of time that you look, the very first time you look at a word, and go past time, which is the total time you look at a word before you go on to the next one. So that might include multiple fixations. And we reason that if readers are in fact allocating their attention to categories instead of individual words, in cases of uncertainty in particular, then reading should be faster when the category is probable than when it's improbable. And I also have a really fun analysis where we apply this not just to the words that people actually predict in context, which would trivially have cluster probabilities associated with them, but also the words that have cluster probabilities that people didn't guess. So these would be words that maybe are really closely related to other words that were guessed, but end up assigned to a particular cluster and gain probability mass that way. So the first fixation duration data that I'm going to show you, I'm going to be plotting cluster probability on the x-axis and first fixation duration on the y-axis. Something that I will tell you is that, first of all, I cannot replicate their original analyses. I don't know what they did that's different from mine. Their original analyses I can't get to converge on any machine I've tried. But one thing that they claim matters is closed probability in their data, and closed probability doesn't matter in this data. It affects the data likelihood. So if you look at delta log likelihood, it's better, but the coefficient is not significant. And so I don't know what to make of that. I'm just going to plot cluster probability because the closed probability effect looks like nothing. There are lots of factors that are probably related to lexical processing. So if you add word intercepts to these models, these are small effects, okay? If we plot cluster probability on the x-axis and first fixation duration on the y-axis, this is log transformed and centered and scaled. There is a small negative effect that shows that the more probable the cluster is, the faster the reading times are. And also, when a word is not assigned a closed probability, so those are words nobody guessed, but we have a cluster probability for those, we see a similar effect, but it's a bit attenuated. First fixation durations are interesting from a cognitive point of view because it really suggests that this is just a physiological response to seeing the word. It's not really clear to me that semantics should very strongly influence this because it's sort of, well, the basics of pre-perceptual input. But when we look at go past durations, we see a nicer effect. It's a bigger effect, showing that as words become more probable in their clusters, the faster the reading times tend to be. This is generally considered to be an index of semantic processing, in addition to any other extra stuff that the reading time people will argue about. But also what's really cool is that you see the same effect in cluster probability for both words that people guessed and words that people didn't. And together, we see that the effect is clearly more compelling for go past durations than for first fixation durations, but it's overall very similar. I can also show you this effect for just the words that were unguessed. And we see that words that belong to, especially words that belong to clusters that are the only cluster that are guessed, but that the word was not one that people guessed. Maybe it's just a variant on like a preposition or something like that. Reading times are much, much faster for those words that belong to probable clusters than words that belong to rarer clusters. So we're actually able to account for reading times that we would otherwise be unable to, that, you would just say, okay, 0% close probability. You're throwing away some of the semantic structure that seems to influence reading times. So with that, I think that we can see that there are some major advantages to processing words that belong to probable categories. It's less clear what to do for words that I didn't present to you, which are words that don't belong to a cluster that anybody guessed at all. Those would have 0% probabilities of those clusters, and they're quite, the reading times are higher, but there's probably a cluster probability that I could acquire by doing something smarter. If I was going to channel, the MIT people of the world, I would say, okay, well, I could use surprisal for this. I have built these models with surprisal, and the effect still holds. So it goes beyond even just very, very precise close probability estimates. And also, if you use surprisal and aggregate in the same way as cluster probability, so you take those probabilities instead of close, you get the same effects. So it's not necessarily the case that it's the lexical component to it does seem to matter, but it's also the case that the semantics seem to continue to influence production or processing speed. Yes.
So
we have all on. Yeah.
I'm curious about that just because it's so hard to find things that improve prediction of reaction time above surprisal. What are the sizes of these models, and like what are their how good are they basically in terms of their fit to like, are they big models when you're
there are about 66,000 observations of these.
The surprisals.
So it depends on your flavor, but so we use either GPT-2, which is small and modest. That's the one that Corey Shane will tell you is the best one ever. I don't like it because it tends to produce predictions that don't feel very intuitive to me. And in fact, we found better correlations with the Pythia model, which uses more open data from a more diverse set of resources than just web text. So those probabilities tend to be a little bit better. But the important part is that that's also not a very big. We use the model that is the same in size-ish as the GPT-2 model, and they're 160 million parameters, so really not very large. I don't like using very big models. I only use these somewhat reluctantly because this is the only way you're allowed to do reading time analyses anymore, which is deeply irritating. But the important thing is, they're not enormous. They're not trained on very, very large amounts of data. They're not prompt tuned, or nobody's done any kind of reinforcement learning on these. I haven't fine tuned them on any additional tasks. But yeah, the surprisal values kind of go in exactly the direction you would expect, so that they correlate very strongly with closed probabilities. They also, you know, are better objectively at words that are not guessed. So, you know, there are arguments about whether closed probability is better than surprisal or not. Surprisal is great for unexpected words.
Yeah, so the reason I'm asking, I guess, is I'm curious if you look at the calibration of a particular LM, like autoregressive LM, I guess, against the humans in terms, like based on the close. So if you say, like, I'm going to measure this model's calibration, does that count as a better calibrated model? Does the surprises from a better calibrated model end up predicting region times better in the sense of explaining more of the variance that you could have explained from the clusters? So basically, does like
Effect size of the clustering effect.
Yeah, where basically my thinking is like, well, if it turns out that just bigger and bigger models end up better calibrated, then it could be that you end up like chopping through the effect of the cluster.
Yeah. So that's something that that was part of the paper that I didn't get to have anyone review. We were looking at the degree to which these sort of semantic factors are represented early in the model, and that's why the surprisals are better. It seems like because the different models work slightly differently in the ones that we tested, there are some geometric things that make it very hard to do that question here. I think that the answer is yes. So that the models are doing some semantic level processing in a way that generates good probability distributions in the end, and that would potentially cannibalize the effect that we're interested in here. That's also part of why I didn't report the surprisal analyses, because they're just this is just one of those cover your bases kind of things. Yeah, I mean, so if the surprisals themselves reflect semantic integration that happens further down, then maybe it's just they're too good at predicting probabilities of words, and so they're not actually good at predicting semantic level category probabilities. We do grab these from the middle layers. The clusters are estimated over middle layers. It turns out, for those of you who are interested in this, the middle layers of Roberta have the least lexicality. So if you try and take the embedding representations and then you run them through the part that does all the prediction, the model for all the sentences we have here, like they basically just predict punctuation. So the space of those representations is very different. And then only through passing through those further higher layers does it start to look like a prediction task. And that's part of what we used as justification for picking the layers that we use here, that they seem to be less sensitive to individual words. It's also the case that the model that we use, Roberta, is less sensitive to surprisal in general. It's not a next word prediction model. It's also less sensitive to word frequency, which is also, I think, really, really critical for the sort of bias level that we're interested in accounting for. Yeah, that's fun. Yes. Sorry, I forgot about you.
So every time you say surprisal, you mean lexicon surprisal.
Yeah.
That's surprisal as an information theoretic measure of the amount of processing.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of language models, surprisal. Yeah. So next word, probabilities.
Yeah, so that is by definition, right? Word levels. Because I mean, in line with what you're saying, a lot of reviews have emphasized this technique of word prediction. And like IT squeezing every R squared percentage of predicting the IT by the next word. And so on, of course, multiple levels of processing. Which might very well be surprisal. And this does look very surprising-ish right here.
Yeah. So I don't see these as conflicting approaches. It's really more that the way that I've been thinking about it is in the context of this Quisto paper. They argue that at higher level orders of prediction, when in cases of uncertainty, say most sentence processing, you would instead predict a higher order category and then access from within that any sort of particular sort of events. So they actually use a really cute example in that paper of you're in like the office coffee part of of your like workplace, and somebody goes into the coffee section and they have a mug, and you'll be like, oh, okay, they're gonna fill their mug with coffee, but instead they go to the sink. So you're conditionalizing already on the schema of like what one does in a coffee place. So the degree to which you might expect any one of these events, right, you can revise in the face of a violation, but it's still consistent with this high level schema that you have about what people do in kitchens. Yeah.
It's basically smart smoothing, right?
Yeah.
That's right. So that brings me to the second part of my question. There. It's whether one could somehow disentangle the effects of having specifically clusters from counter discounting or so those probabilities are not just word predictions, they're also really quantifying. So it's a large smoothing problem. I'm sure under you too.
Yeah.
Whenever you look at the studies, that you have so many closed equals zero. Right?
Yep.
And if I do gum smoothing, then I throw them all in the same bin. And then one way to address also Aaron's questions. Other smoothing baselines, it's not just backing out to semantic categories. So it's not just that you have information where you have zero information, otherwise you have other information.
Yeah.
I've
thought about doing a part of speech version of this that looks at the part of speech tags. And I think that it would probably still be useful, but I haven't done the analysis. It's again one of those cases where I didn't want to do all of the possibilities because there's a lot of model comparisons. And I didn't want to have it be like, oh, well, if you run this additional model, because I think if you have part of speech level information, it's still consistent with this general claim. I do know of some related work, I think out of Tal Linzen's lab, where they have a system that does joint lexical prediction and CCG category synthesis. And they find that the language model surprisingly still underpredicts syntactic processing phenomena, even when you add in that syntactic information, which I think suggests that there's obvious extra linguistic or high-level semantic processing that's just not encoded in these models. Yeah, so like none of these things has event knowledge per se. Yeah, but they could, but you could somehow encode that. Oh my God, let me just complain about one thing first, which was that the first time I submitted some of this data to an ACL venue, people told me language models don't know what a closed task is. What if you tell a language model that the closed task is a thing? And I was like, I'm not going to prompt tune a language model for this. But I appreciate that you can only think about things in terms of prompting. It is true that people do a task, right? So it's not the case that this is just an unbiased sense of how language production unfolds. But yeah, your next question.
Actually, maybe I would argue it's not language production data. If you really ask them to complete a sentence, then I do understand the reviewer's comments.
Yeah.
If you guess the next word, then I think you're right. The task presumably matters because there's lots of evidence that people get too creative.
Yeah, and it's certainly the case that most of the probabilities that are rare responses from these language models also underestimate the likelihood of those answers. They do not do well with human variation. So they hedge their bets on very, very probable responses. It's been tricky to move beyond that because some people say that's obvious and some people say it's not. And those reviewers typically all assign me low scores. So I just don't worry about it too much. But you had a different question. Well, I think I have 10 more minutes. But I think I only have a conclusion slide actually, and then like a future directions slide. So this one is basically that I think that it seems sort of straightforward to me that semantic hierarchical structure or quasi-semantic structure influences both the production and comprehension of words. That sort of this narrow view of processing at an individual word level is a bit restrictive. I think it's also really interesting to think about whether I'm actually measuring the things that I say that I'm measuring. So Are the reading effects the kinds of things that people argue about, that there's prediction to this, or is it more of an integration effect? So maybe reading a word that fits with your semantic expectations is a different thing than predicting the next word. One of the other things I haven't solved is whether this production process includes some deliberation, which would trivially explain some of the competition effects that we see. Although I do think that it's pretty tricky to get, when you cut down the reaction times to like 1,000 milliseconds, it's very hard to say that there's a lot of deliberation there. It's also not obvious to me that production in general doesn't involve deliberation in real cases. So especially if you talk to people with anxiety, they tell you that they have to weigh all the possibilities before they talk. And if that's the case, then they still have some knowledge of the possibilities that they have to narrow down. It's not like that goes away. But it's certainly not the case that, when we do picture naming studies, that those work, that those are tapping into the same knowledge as some more sentence production level tasks. Okay, so I wanted to share some of the future directions that I think would be really cool. So again, like partialing out some of these nuisance factors. All my models include frequency, but they don't include part of speech information. They have, intercepts by word, but they don't have sort of more syntactic level predictions. I'd like to use a real ontology to validate the structure of these concepts, which maybe could you could imagine a task where I refine the category structure with feedback. I'd also really like to know how manipulating the surrounding context, this gets back to the phonological question. If you swap out certain words, you can look at the effect on people's predictions, and we currently don't have a way to causally test that with these stimuli. So I think it would be really interesting to swap out words like, a cow or something like that in a sentence and see how that affects people's preference for couch and so on. Artificial example, it turns out it's a little tricky to do this, but we can construct stimuli. That'd be fun. I also think that one of the things that's been very limiting about this is the first study is just random people from the University of Illinois participant pool. And they have their own linguistic biases that kind of work well for psycholinguistic experiments and psycholinguistic stimuli. Likewise, the Provo corpus is a bunch of BYU undergrads. Rich Mormon kids, right, also have different knowledge than general people across the whole country, across the world. So I really want to spend some time looking at lexical predictability and the semantic structure of people's predictions in varieties of English. So in particular, I'm in Buffalo. Buffalo is an extremely segregated city. I think it's more segregated than Rochester. We have highways carving out all kinds of neighborhoods from each other. And because of this segregation, you actually get some really interesting dialect differences that are very obvious at the level of pronunciation. So if you go to the snobby suburbs in the north parts of town, those folks talk very differently from the more working class southern parts of town, folks who used to live in the rail yards and things like that. But also the west side of the city has a lot of Puerto Ricans, a very strong Caribbean Spanish, Chicano English kind of thing going on. And then east side of Buffalo is very Black and Middle Eastern. And those folks all don't really get to integrate with each other because of how we structure the sort of spaces that we allow people to enter. And I think that this would have big consequences for using this type of data at all, because different people have different biases about what they think is going to happen. If I do get to run this study, if someday the grant agencies allocate money again, I would really like to do this also to understand spontaneous production, so a spoken version of the task, because I think that, again, like this whole word production side is a little limiting, and type production in particular is very limiting in understanding the constraints that speakers use in real communicative tasks. So hopefully we can get a little bit closer to that by doing that. Okay, so I have a thank you slide for all the cool people who have worked with me on these projects. I'm especially grateful to Loic Robol, who has basically helped me work through a lot of the math and validate my intuitions, think about things in this more formal framework, as well as all the folks who have helped me, sort of listen to my various versions, probed me about my feelings. So thank you.
And that's it.
Yeah, and Zoom people can ask me questions. I'm very happy to take questions. Oh, yes. Wait.
I had a really general question that you might be able to answer, or Florian, or someone. And I like to add a line early in some of my project proposals that argues that some of these N400-y kind of closed paradigms are a little weird in the sense that people are going to go in and in advance with making decisions about this or otherwise, or work findings and stuff. And I like to say that, doing this in the context of speech, reading or listening to just to comprehend will make this meta judgment is important to do. So I don't know, in the eye movement, reading times, reaction time literature, is there some signature of weirdness, as some say? Maybe this is not a question, I apologize if it is. It's just something when you're talking.
Well, one thing that I think is evident, and obviously, Florian, feel free to tell me that I misunderstood, but so it's an analogous sort of finding to the ERP literature, where you look at sentence final words and you measure N400s, is also clearly happening in sentence reading with fixations that are longer for words that occur at the ends of sentences. So as you see, these things called wrap-up effects, and people spend a lot of time sort of making sure that they've understood the sentence before they go on to the next one. There's also big sentence boundary effects, so words that are at the end of a print block take longer to read. I think that the task itself, so I think for the reading time data, people don't really know the close task that kind of went into those measures. That's not usually the same participants. But I think that there have been cases where people have tried to get people to do both of those things, like they have the task normed afterward or something like that.
Isn't it looking Christians? I mean, that gets.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only reading.
Yeah.
I know that has closed.
Well, there's ours. We have, we don't have reading times, but we do have N4s. And one thing that we've been looking at is ERPs to sentence final words and words over the course of the whole sentences. So Kara's stimuli were basically designed to manipulate the last word in the sentence, and there are sentences that are either strongly or weakly constraining. But when we collected these closed norms, participants didn't have to go into a sentence. They didn't get that many. They didn't have to go into a dark room and read words one at a time. It is still an artificial task. One thing that's interesting is that, first of all, if somebody is wrong on one word, it doesn't predict whether they're wrong on the next word. So it does seem like their guesses are somewhat independent at each time step, which is kind of cool. That is to say, accuracy is kind of even over the course of the whole sentence. But then the ERPs that we have. So we see general predictability level effects that occur for every word in this sentence, but they're very pronounced at the last word in the sentence, which are sort of experimentally manipulated. But we also find that the N4 is not really the most sensitive measure to prediction as people have construed it. So the Gina Cooperbergs of the world see it as like, well, lexical, this sort of individual word predictability or structural predictability is the N4's kind of job. And I think that that's true to the extent that there's semantic integration that has to happen when processing those sentences. The N4 mostly reflects semantic processing, I personally believe, but also I think the evidence is mostly in that direction. We've used a method, this is a paper that I'm trying to get Ryan to write up, where he's really worked a lot with like representational similarity analysis and looking at scalp distributions of the previous time step and comparing them to the current time step. And those seem to be much more sensitive to prediction and the way that we sort of operationalize it with like, closed probability measures or surprisals. Which I think suggests that this sort of prediction mechanism is partly an updating procedure, right? So we have some state that we're in, and then the stimulus itself modifies that state. And that's what we often think of as prediction. So, but that effect is also the case. We see that for both final words and words throughout the whole sentences. Whereas the N4 seems to be really specific to when you get those data. The effects are not as strong for all positions in a sentence. Also kind of funny thing in that these sentences do get more predictable as you go toward the end, right? That's like just generally true. If you look at the Luke and Christensen probabilities, actually, you see a nice sort of jump, right? Over the course of the sentence, people get better and better guessing what the next word is. But then there's a huge drop when you get to the sentence boundary, and then they have to kind of restart, right? So it doesn't seem like they're actually doing prediction in a way that's fully sensitive to the prior context. Maybe they just don't see the previous sentence as all that relevant. Certainly in these texts, it probably doesn't matter that much. Yes.
Well, I mean, there is now a bunch of evidence that suggests that if you go through sentences that are weird, right, including N400 sentences, in which expected and unexpected continuations by design are counterbalanced, then the N400 amplitude decreases with the part of the experiment, which is what you would expect with or without close judgments if you're doing something that contradicts your expectations. Reading through recent Prasad and Lindsay, syntactic adaptation at a much slower time scale than the original publications. So that's the price that's there, right? So they're just incremental, lexical, and syntactic applications. I think I agree mostly with how you characterize it. Having worked with her, I would not believe the N400 is a lexical signature. It's
Sure.
a signature. But yes, the late positivities, thought to reflect updating on some stuff. It's a very big control one that kind of make us thinking about kind of hinting at ecological validity. I completely agree, and I think it's a fair point. And there's evidence that as I think my hypothesis 10, 15 years ago, it matters that you balance these levels.
I cannot remember his name off the top of my head, but yeah, I think Eddie, one of Kara's former students / postdocs, had a study where they had sentences that were like mostly not predictable, and that does affect whether you see the N4. And I think that Joost Blomers has one too. Yeah, so definitely the distribution affects it. I don't know what you would do if you were in a dark room seeing words word by word for 3 hours and not want to do something like that. Yeah, it's a. Oh yeah.
There are two tests where they kind of reflect the uniform prior over the max composition. So it suggests
Oh, that's very cool.
Which has not been replicated, but it's also pretty recent. Just a kind of a general thought on. I think it's really interesting. I'm wondering if you go forward with it. There's two approaches, right? One is you have to take a network-based approach, like channel and merge, and you maybe merge what you get from language models with this network-based approach. Instead of trying to clusters, you just directly take the distances in that space and make them a network, the network layers allows you to fit.
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about just making the network sparser than a fully connected graph. I think that would account for some of these differences. I don't know what the features would be necessarily, but I think that you could capture some of these phenomena better by saying, okay, well, these are just not fully connected, right? That they're not, it's not the case that has legs is even relevant to, tables or whatever, or they do have legs, I guess.
Another quick comment there is that I think we can, if we start to re-engineer this, mixed effects regression analyses in which we throw more and more factors, I think we won't always finding a little bit more variance.
Yeah.
So it's got to be a good approach to take what people believe to be a network-based architecture in the brain, but to bring in your ideas about, say, yeah, I like the idea of tuning, right? And I think that strikes me ultimately as a productive way. After you've now shown the merit of these, which was critical to really see, like, is that sufficient? Because otherwise we'll keep going back to what people did in the early 2000s, having 50 predictors, so
Yeah.
competition and everything correlates with everything and everything's significant.
Do y'all know, one thing that I've wanted to extend this method for has been to basically take these sentences from Kara's studies, but make them similar to her 99 paper with Marta, where she has these, they wanted to make the hotel seem like a tropical resort. And so along the avenue, they planted rows of, and it's supposed to be palms, right? But then they either show pines or tulips also. I have wanted to look at the category structure that they argue for, and then use these clusters to basically pick the words and then test this like in a bigger context. Because I think that if there is some reality to like the semantic structure of this prediction, then that should still be feasible. Like the stimuli should both be good, and we should still be able to replicate the effects that they see there. I think that this is definitely a case where we want to be smarter about how we design our studies. I don't think that even naturalistic stimuli are going to be the best option for this, which is, too bad for the surprisal boys. But I think that, for real, like the surprisal stimuli, first of all these language models have the Luke and Christensen text in them. They're on the web. Like Luke just got them from like a website. Second of all, if the language models are memorizing these things, then of course they're going to assign better probabilities to them.
That's not working.
They don't do a good job with real sentences.
That works against surprisal theory. That, I don't know, Aaron, whether you were asking because of that, why the really recent ChatGPT model do not turn out to be such great predictors of human behavior, because they memorize such stuff.
Yep.
I think William Schuler was the first person at Ohio who really clearly pointed this out. So spot on and a pretty convincing argument.
Yeah,
but in this case, that works against surprisal theory.
Yeah.
All right, we should wrap up. We don't have the room much longer.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody.